Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Conversations That Count, a production of Fairfax County Republican Committee. Fairfax County Republican Committee is a diverse, open, and inclusive political committee that welcomes people like you and me with similar political interests. Please join us as we continue to build a party in Fairfax that believes in life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness for all of us. I am Shrileka Pale, Vice Chair of Campaigns and Elections at Fairfax County GOP. It is my pleasure to introduce one of our candidates for Attorney General of Commonwealth of Virginia, Mr. Jason Miyares. Mr. Miyares grew up in Virginia Beach, attending local public schools and growing up in middle-class household that emphasize the values of hard work, love of country, and service above self. In November of 2015, he won the open seat to the 82nd District for the House of Delegates by the widest margin in the district's history, while becoming the first Cuban American ever elected to the Virginia General Assembly. In the House of Delegates, Mr. Miyares serves on the General Laws, Courts of Justice, and Transportation Committees, where he has worked to build smarter, more accountable government, working on transparency and regulatory reform. Recognized as champion of free enterprise by the Virginia Chamber of Commerce, Delegate Miyares has consistently opposed higher taxes and regulations that make it harder for small business owners to expand and thrive. In 2019, Mr. Miyares advanced landmark legislation that makes it easier for small business owners to provide childcare services as a benefit to their employees. He's a former prosecutor for the city of Virginia Beach. Mr. Miyares also worked to keep our most violent criminals off our streets and our families safe. Let's welcome Jason Miyares. Now I welcome my co-host and friend, Vincent Xavier. Many of you know as Vincent is the Vice Chair of Outreach with Fairfax County Republicans. He is passionate about conservative values and is courageous leader of Fairfax County Party to begin this conversations. Welcome, Vincent.
Thank you, Sri. Thank you very much. And thank you, Jason, for joining us today. And thank you for running and wanting to have a career as an Attorney General of Commonwealth of Virginia. We need proven leaders like you and a strong voice that believes in American values. I understand that you are of Cuban American descent. Your mother legally immigrated in 1960s from communist Cuba. And as immigrants ourselves, we are so proud to see you running for AGO Virginia. And I can imagine how proud your mother is about you, about your achievements in the country that she came to embrace. So can you tell us more about that and the lessons you learned earlier on from your mom about communism?
Well, Vincent, I really appreciate you all having me and being able to have a kind of a more in-depth discussion. Yeah, you're right. My mother left Cuba in 1965. And, when you grow up in a household with somebody who had 5+ years of living under the kind of the hell of Castro's kind of socialist paradise, obviously I'm being sarcastic there. The impact of socialism, it's not just a theory. It's not something you just read in a textbook. It's the impact is literally in your DNA. And I often like to say that my story doesn't begin in Virginia Beach, Virginia. It actually, in a unique way, kind of begins in Havana, Cuba. When a scared 19-year-old girl got on an airplane, literally penniless and homeless, not knowing where her next meal is going to come from. And, my mom is the strongest woman I've ever met, the toughest woman I've ever met. But I have learned more things from her and just those stories growing up. But ultimately, so many of the story of what she's done is the kind of the classic immigrant story. Ultimately, you're giving up your own dreams so your children or your future children can achieve what you couldn't. And there's a certain poetic beauty to that, and the idea of sacrificing. But it gives you a perspective that perhaps, sometimes it takes an outsider's perspective to recognize that this is indeed the most unique, amazing country in the history of the world. And big reason why I'm running for the House of Delegates is, a conversation I had with her the Friday night before the election, to be honest with you, where we were talking. If you know anything about Cuban Americans, we're passionate people, we're conservative people. I remember my earliest memories. Two of my earliest memories was both seeing my mother take the oath of allegiance to become a citizen of the United States. And to this day, it's my favorite thing to do as a delegate is speak. The last naturalization ceremony I did, there were 117 people from 56 different countries. And it was an early memory of mine. The other early memory was my mother taking me with her to go vote in her first presidential election for Ronald Reagan's re-election in 1984. And that's why in my home office, I keep a portrait of President Reagan over my shoulder. It's one of not only one of my favorite early memories, but he remains one of my favorite presidents because he really understands that the shining city on a hill is not just a catchphrase. It's really something unique about what this country is, and we're losing that. But you know, that conversation to have my mom the Friday night before the election, she said, listen, she was scared. I mean, we talk politics all the time since my earliest memory. But it was the first time in all the years I've talked to her, I'm 45, that she was scared. And that's a hard thing. I mean, I come from a broken home, and that's a hard thing when you hear your mom scared. But I said, Mamita, what's going on? And she said, I never thought the rhetoric that I used to hear in Havana, Cuba in the 1960s, I'd hear in America today by a major political party. And I'm 74 years old. I'm too old to ever go through that again. And that just struck me to my core. So that was late October of 2020, and kind of went through about a 3-4 week period of talking to my wife about it because it so disturbed me, that idea of where we are. And, I love to talk to young people. I love to talk to high school groups, senior days and government classes. And I always ask them this question. I say, why did my mom come here? What was so unique about America? She went from Cuba, she immigrated to Spain, and then legally came to the United States. And culturally, it would have been easier for her to stay in Spain. But ultimately, she wanted to live in a country that recognized that her rights came from God and not from some politician in DC or Richmond. And that American miracle has provided more second chances and more opportunities to more people from more different backgrounds than any country in the history of the world. And, my mom fled Cuba in the fall of 1965, leaving a country with no consent of the government. And almost 50 years to the day that she left, she was able to vote for me to represent her in the oldest democracy in the Western Hemisphere, the Virginia House of Delegates, where I serve now. She's by far my most vocal constituent. But that's the American miracle. But, that American miracle has been recreated so many times by first generation Americans. And if there's anything that just disturbs me about where we are as a country, it's we're losing the acknowledgement that we are indeed what Abraham Lincoln called the last best hope on earth. Mm-hmm. And if you think about when Lincoln said that, that's a pretty remarkable statement. We were in the midst of a horrific civil war. We're only 80 years old as a country. But I think part of Lincoln's genius was he understood what we could become as a country. And it's why, I guess, over my shoulder, you'll see a bust of President Lincoln as well. It's another one of my favorites as well. But for him to say that at a time, I'm sure nobody at that time was looking at America in the midst of a horrific civil war thinking, wow, America's the last best hope on earth. But Lincoln, I think, knew that. And Lincoln actually took that statement, believe it or not, from Jefferson. Jefferson was the first to use the term in his writings. And Lincoln was a voracious reader and admirer of Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson, under those words, we were just maybe 2-3 decades old as a country, but Jefferson as well was a visionary and knew what we could become as a nation. And so, but that American miracle is being challenged in ways I never thought I would see a challenge. I know my mother never thought it'd be challenged. Vincent, I'm sure you probably never thought you would see some of the rhetoric and the language that we see in America today, embracing concepts of socialism and things of that really has wreaked so much destruction in so many countries, from Venezuela to Cuba count your nation. I mean, I love to tell young people the year Fidel Castro took power in Cuba, Cuba had the same GDP as Italy. And the year Fidel Castro died, it had the same GDP as Sudan. If you think socialism actually works, you always run out of other people's money, as I think it was Winston Churchill may have said that. But we've seen that, and people ultimately, they come here knowing that this is not a land of oppression, this is a land of opportunity. When you speak at a naturalization ceremony, the one thing I get is I'm standing up where the judge is, and they take that oath of allegiance. It is such a powerful moment, but you realize they are here because they view this as indeed that last best hope. And it's infuriating for me that we are now losing sight of that in some of our national discussion. And I tell people, if you ever want to feel proud about your country, go to a naturalization ceremony and talk to those people. And I think that's so critical. And I think every Republican should. We're the party of opportunity. We're the party of individual dignity. We're the party of freedom of conscience and freedom of religion and your ability to worship God to the dictates of your conscience, and a belief that nobody should ever come in and try to order you otherwise. And I think we're losing that right now, in my opinion.
No, you're absolutely correct. Especially when you said that it affects your DNA. It's not just the current economy that you watch, the DNA, because in Cuba and Venezuela and places like that, where communism had a violent takeover, that is actually better compared to the people who came like us, later on, without even understanding the damages of socialism. Even now, people don't really know why we are here, because I am from a state named Kerala in India, the first major province in the world where communism came through elections, in a tricky way, in a deceptive manner. And it was not able to produce anything good for us. And that's when we have to go to the Middle East and the Americas and the Canadas to escape the the socialism. And now the damage that has been done to our DNA, that's not even visible to even these people. A very slow process, because when it is abrupt, you notice. But in our case, we don't really notice, what exactly we ran away from. And we come here and continue to support the socialist policies without really knowing what exactly we ran away from. So
Right.
I think in one way, the abrupt change is better than this slow poisoning that has happened, to people like us.
Well, one thing my mom noted was in Cuba, they use all these catchphrases that you hear politicians use today, like "you didn't build that," and "fairness and equity," redistribution of wealth. And they use it to conduct unspeakable horrors against its people. I mean, they would nationalize big business and small business and big farms and small farms. And finally, they came to my mother's home. It was the last thing that happened before she left. They and anybody who's watching on Facebook Live, imagine this: somebody coming to your home and why did Ronald Reagan say the most terrifying words in the English language? "Hello, we're from the government. We're here to help." Right? But imagine they came to my mother's home and they posted a notice on the door that said "Property of the Socialist Revolution," and literally everything that you imagine this, everything you've ever had in this world, everything in my office, everything in every clothes in your closet, anything other than the clothes you have on, every possession, earthly possession you have is literally ripped from you, all in the name of fairness and equity. And it reminds me of a great line from C.S. Lewis, who said, of all the tyrannies in the world, the worst tyrannies are the tyrannies done for your own good, right? Because the people doing it think, well, we're doing this for the great collective good. But, an illustration I love to use for when I talk to high school groups, when I had somebody ask me about, well, shouldn't we always support like the collective good, so to speak? And they were openly and unabashedly for socialism. And I used this story. I said, my mother's dream in Cuba was to become a doctor. And she enrolled at the University of Havana. It was her first day of class. She went to go register. And the communists had already taken over. And she went up to register for classes for pre-med and biology and chemistry. And the people there running her said, no, we have enough doctors. You don't understand. The party, the collective good, we need you to be a teacher. So instead of you taking classes that you want to take, like biology and pre-med, you have to take classes in Marxist-Leninism and teaching courses. And so my illustration is the hideousness of this system was it denied you your individual dignity. In the United States, what makes this country so brilliant is nobody's denying you that individual dignity. You could chase your dreams. There's nobody going to take you away in the middle of the night because you worship God in a manner that the government disagrees with, right? None of that's going to happen. No one's going to tell you for the collective good, you can't be a doctor, you need to be a teacher. You could go chase your individual dream, and that comes down to your individual dignity. If there's anything that I've animated me as a member of the House of Delegates and now as a candidate, is the dignity of the individual. And sometimes we lose track of that right now with the cancel culture and everything else, but we're a unique gift in this world. The United States is a unique country. I was speaking to some Hampton students, and I said, listen, don't forget that why you speak, when people talk about things like privilege, right? I said, at the end of the day, there are literally tens upon tens of millions of people, if not hundreds of millions of people, if not a billion people, that would do everything in their power to be seated exactly where you're seated right now, Vincent, to be called an American.
Yep.
That is winning life's lottery.
Yep.
You have a privilege by the fact that you live in this country and you could achieve your dreams. That's unrivaled, unlike any country. You know, we are the most successful multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious country in the history of the world. Do you ever hear that on the news? Do you ever hear that in the newspaper? Why are we raising an entire generation of children right now to not love their country? And I don't understand that, particularly when we have some of these huge challenges facing our country with COVID and what's going on with the rise of China. My goodness, I'm not saying that we don't recognize where we fall short of our ideals. Of course we do that. Americans have always been able to be self-critical about this is where we need to improve. I'm not saying we don't do that. Of course we do that. But this constant negativity about our country right now is so disturbing because we're raising an entire generation of kids. I have 3 daughters. They're the diamonds of my heart. And I was home a week before last at a reasonable hour, and they wanted to do a movie night. So of course, Disney Plus, they want to watch Lion King. There's this one scene in Lion King that I saw and just struck with me. And not, just bear with me, I'll make my point. But there's this scene where, you know, Simba runs away from his family. He runs away from this tragedy that happened. He ran away from his home. And later on, as he's a little bit older, he has a vision of his father. And his father says, "You have forgotten." And Simba says, I don't understand. He says, "You have forgotten who you are." And I feel like right now as Americans, we are forgotten who we are. We are that shining city on a hill. We are the nation that defeated 2 of the worst tyrannies in the 20th century, Nazi Germany and Soviet communism. We are that country that there's not a country on the planet that gives the amount of charity as Americans do, that give the amount of volunteer hours as Americans do, that when there is a tsunami out over in Asia that will immediately flood the airwaves with money and donations. There's not a nation that then sends their military overseas when there is that natural disaster. And so we have forgotten a little bit of who we are as Americans. And instead of pride, we almost have self-loathing. And I think that can be really problematic right now. So do I believe in practicing aspirational politics and trying to remind us as Virginians our greater nature? Yes, absolutely. Do I, and that's, I think, a little bit, you know, I know we've probably done a little bit of detour and glad to talk about the specific issues in the AG's office, but I also think since we have a little bit more time than a normal, like, hey, you have 5 minutes to speak, for people to understand, well, what makes Jason Miyares tick? That's what makes it tick. When I was growing up, outside of Christmas, July 4th was the single most important holiday of the year in Miyares' household, because I must have heard ad nauseum how lucky I was to be able to breathe the air as a free American. And just gave me this unique perspective of who we are as a people. We are truly a noble and decent country. And you don't hear that anymore in today's political discourse or our media. And I know it in my bones, I know it in my core, that we are a truly noble and decent country. And I want to remind Americans of that. There's a byproduct of me talking about my candidacy for Attorney General. it's to highlight that point.
Exactly. Thank you so much for that. Really appreciate your passion. And we started off with the right question. We can see that you're really passionate about this topic.
I will
So
just keep going and going. So
So Jason, what I really would love to take that last 15 minutes you said and play it to immigrants and kids that are born here over and over and over again. I think you not only gave a recap of why immigrants appreciate this country, but it's, I think one sentence that you mentioned that resonated with me is, this is not a land of oppression, this is a land of opportunities. And it's a shame that entire generation of kids only get to hear the negative aspects of America and not the positive aspects that your mom seeked out to, and I as a migrant seeked out America for that reason. So I appreciate the last 15 minutes about your passion towards America. I think we will play that over again. I can tell you. So now
Thank
getting
you.
on to the issue. Yeah.
You're very kind and gracious. You're very kind and gracious.
That is the truth. I was just sitting and listening. I'm like, I wish kids would listen those quotes about Reagan, Winston Churchill, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln. The more they hear, the more they understand the root of America and not why we do not want this country to turn out to be a socialistic country. So now getting on to the issues, Jason, what is your position on sanctuary cities and localities refusing to work with ICE? If you're not in approval of those, then I want to hear your message to the businesses who are for it for cheap illegal immigrant labor. What's your message to the liberal bleeding hearts that are ready to throw away our law and order and a great country for the lunacy of some higher moral ground?
Well, listen, if there's one thing that frustrates me in the great immigration debate is we're missing a couple. There's two key points where I think where the American people are. One, we're an incredibly generous country. There's not a country in the world that allows the level of immigration that we do of legal immigration. A million legal immigrants a year. Mexico doesn't allow that level of immigration. There's not a country in the European Union that allows that level of immigration. There's nobody that does. Where the American people are is they're saying, listen, we embrace people. But there's a big difference between people that come through the system properly, legally, versus people who decide to cut in line illegally. And if there's anything I think the media kind of misses on that is how much that can offend the people that come here and wait their line in turn. We're very close family friends with a Venezuelan family that has come here literally, and they've paid $74,000 of legal fees in order to become an American citizen, their family. And so as they told me, they say, we didn't cut in line, we did this to proper channels. And why this is important for me personally, as I noted, my favorite thing to do is speak at naturalization ceremonies. Like I said, it's one of my earliest memories was seeing my mom take that oath of allegiance. The most powerful moment there is when you have everybody there in that room from every single racial background, every single faith background, they take that oath of allegiance to the United States Constitution. They take an oath that they will be willing to serve in our nation's armed forces if called upon to do so. But most importantly, they swear an oath that they swear off any allegiance to any foreign power or prince or government. And let me tell you, and Vincent, you probably know this, when that happens, and I'm sitting up there near the judge, so I get to see their faces, it is one of the most powerful, awe-inspiring moments because they are literally swearing off the allegiance of their previous home to the idea and the hope of what America is. And I've seen U.S. attorneys literally pull people out of the audience that won't mouth those words, that oath of allegiance. That's how serious, these are federal prosecutors, that's how serious they take it. And when you come here and you cross the border illegally, you're not taking that oath of allegiance. You're not taking the oath that you will now serve our armed forces and take an oath to serve the United States if called upon to serve if we are ever attacked. You're not called upon to swear off an allegiance to any foreign power or king or government. And so, we are a generous country. We have always been a nation of immigrants. But when you have Americans around feeling that they're being taken advantage of by people that are literally crossing over illegally, that's a totally different thing. And so, and the people that have come here properly, and they cross the T's, they dot the I's, they obviously expend the money to become U.S. citizens. They don't want to see that either. So that I'm against sanctuary cities And this shows you out of touch. I'm a prosecutor for a number of years at Virginia Beach. I think this is critical when we talk about the Attorney General's office. You know, who you're going to trust to keep your family and your children safe in their schools in the neighborhood. At the end of the day, this shows you how misplaced this Attorney General is. You have Mark Herring, who previously to Mark Herring, you had something called Project Exile. Project Exile went after anybody who committed violence with the use of a gun. You would get a 5-year mandatory minimum, right? If you want to go after gun violence, you don't go after law-abiding citizens that have done nothing wrong. They just want to exercise their Second Amendment rights. You go after the felons that literally have used a gun in the commission of a crime. It started under Bob McDonald. Several Republican attorney generals had started it. I'm old enough to remember when Richmond was the murder capital of America. Gun violence plummeted because you go after those hardened criminals that, like I said, don't go after the innocent Virginia citizens. You just want to exercise their constitutional right. Go after those that are usually using the gun in the commission of a felony. It dropped. Well, guess what? Mark Herring decided to essentially discontinue prosecuting Project Exile cases. It was a joint program with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Why? Because the Trump administration had a requirement that if you pick up somebody here illegally, and think about this, you picked up somebody here illegally who used a gun in the commission of a felony, you would have to report that to ICE. And Mark Herring, rather than use that money, accept that federal grant money to prosecute bad guys, turned that money down. Now, who do you think is better to trust for you to protect your safe and make your family safe and secure? It's not Mark Herring. He would rather push a far left radical agenda than accept federal grant money to go after the bad guys who are literally using guns in the commission of a felony, while at the flip side, pushing laws and legislation that would disarm innocent law-abiding Virginia gun owners and suddenly make them felons when they haven't committed any crimes. So it shows misplaced priorities. It shows that, listen, I will put up, obviously, with my family story and my personal passion, I will put up, they like the media likes to somehow try to spew that we're somehow anti-immigrant. We obviously know that's nothing further from the truth. What we want to do is we believe we're a nation of laws, not men. We want to follow the laws. We allow 1 million immigrants a year, and that means that we have to have some type of control. And I view it as a homeland security issue. We should be able to, a country that can't control the sovereignty of its borders is no longer a sovereign nation. So I just think on a host of those issues, I think the Democrats have way overreached on this. They have I don't think that's where Virginia voters are. We're a welcoming nation. We're a welcoming state. But I think you have to have some control or it just gets completely out of hand.
Jason, let me thank you for actually bringing up what Mark Herring did. We did interview the candidates, and when it comes to LG Attorney General, we just assume people know about the opponents. So we really haven't brought up many questions about your opponent. So I'm glad you brought it up and explained to our folks of what his policies are. That's, I think, very impactful.
Yeah, that's definitely, Jason. I wanted to ask you, we have heard that the National Association of Attorneys Generals has described the office as an intersection of law and order, and public policy. So what do you believe? You mentioned immigration enforcement and ICE-related stuff. But what do you believe are the 3 most important law enforcement priorities, say, under your Commonwealth of, your Attorney General position as the AG?
Well, listen, as Bob McDonald has said, and Bob McDonald's, my state co-chair, and as he noted, this office is seen as Virginia's top cop for a reason, right? You're literally the top law enforcement official in the entire state. So I think that's critically important. As I said, I was a prosecutor. I've been in the room with the victims of violent crime. I think right now you have in Richmond, and with Mark Herring and this McAuliffe Northam Parole Board, you have a criminal first, victim last mindset. It should be reversed. And what you have is you have victims that are literally not having their voice heard. And we've seen a parole board that's literally breaking the law to let out violent criminals and murderers back on the street. So I think number one, if I was to step in as Attorney General, I would immediately investigate and subpoena and go after the McAuliffe Northern Parole Board. Hopefully we'd have a Republican governor that would also fire them. But I think the second is when you see things like what Mark Herring did when a reversal, where he wouldn't participate in programs like Project Exile. It's actually since then, it has a successor name, but it's the same program. But you go after and you do joint prosecutions with the feds against those individuals, people like MS-13, people using firearms in the commission of a felony, and you go after the bad guys. Right now, it doesn't seem like there's any sense to go after the bad guys. I mean, you could see this past year in Richmond and others where you had a wholesale rioting and destruction of small business owners and shops where nobody was ever prosecuted. Why? Because the mayor and the governor and the attorney general agreed with the political aims of the individuals that were doing the destructions of Richmond. And the best that I can tell, I don't know if anybody's ever actually been prosecuted for the wholesale destruction. These are the small business owners. They're the first to show up in the morning. They're the last to leave at night. Many of them put their life savings in their business. It's been their dream, and they saw it go up in smokes. And that's beyond disturbing. So I think that's critically important from that. And then a third issue that's personally passionate for me is human trafficking. I've done a lot of work with the Safe House Project. I've been recognized by them for some work I've done on that front. I think that's critically important. Anybody who doesn't think that it's happening, it absolutely does. My hometown of Virginia Beach is a very transient community. It's a tourist town as well. I could guarantee it happens a lot. I know it happens a lot in the 81 corridor as well. Human trafficking is a critically important issue. And then finally, you have to realize the Attorney General's office literally handles every single criminal appeal for the entire state. And I was literally just earlier today having a conversation with a Commonwealth's attorney. Out of not getting this person in trouble, I won't say their name, but they were sharing a story. They had prosecuted an individual who had multiple domestic violence abuses. The person fled the state, didn't show up for the hearing. This prosecutor issued a capias, which is an arrest warrant for this person's arrest. You can't do that. You can't just suddenly say, hey, listen, I've had multiple charges. I'm not going to show up to court after I told the judge that I'm going to show up for court. And the person, the perpetrator, the defendant, had the audacity of actually suing, saying that this was improper. And the Attorney General's office literally was handling the appeal, and literally called this Commonwealth's attorney and asked him, well, why don't you just no pros all the charges? No pros means you drop the charges, so this guy will drop his civil suit. I mean, that is so the audacity. This person literally. So you're going to see he's going to get away from committing multiple domestic violence crimes because he's had the temerity of filing a civil suit. You're going to give him a get out of jail free card and just drop the charges. So when you don't have the mindset of a prosecutor, and instead you have a mindset of, as I like to say, Mark Herring is Virginia's Eric Holder. He's a far left-wing progressive ideologue. He wants to criminalize the rights of law-abiding Virginians that want to exercise their Second Amendment rights. He wants to go after, he has no sense of absolutely what, in my opinion, what the police go through. And he has complete upside down priorities right now in Richmond. I think it just goes to show you they desperately need a different mindset of what's going on in Richmond right now.
So that's great to hear, Jason. Really appreciate that. And it's very reassuring to hear as a person who walked away from the Democrats and became a Republican, because when I realized that they lack common sense, it's always reassuring to hear from Republican candidates. They are standing for the same exact principles that I think are important for a nation to survive and stand. So thank you so much for those priorities, and really very, very reassuring.
So Jason, as I mentioned to you in the beginning, this is Facebook Live. So we have a very conservative friend of ours in Fairfax County Republican Committee. He actually ran as a board of supervisor in the district that I ran as board of supervisor, and ran a phenomenal campaign. Have two questions for you. So I'll kind of ask those two questions, just answer in the order of which you think is appropriate. The first question is, why did Jason draft a red flag bill that died after pressure from conservative groups? And the same person's another question is, What specifically will Jason do to protect Christians from being persecuted by the federal government? Will he enforce the Equality Act of past? I thought those two are good.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm glad that I'll probably just ask them in the order they were answered. So listen, I think there is a little bit of a misnomer. I've never voted for a red flag bill. The current law on the books was House Bill 674. I voted against it both in January 30th of 2020, and I voted against it on March 2nd, 2020 as well. I'm a lifetime A rating with the NRA, and I think my lifetime rating with the VCDL is 98 or 99%. I'm a passionate believer in the Second Amendment. As I like to tell oftentimes at high school groups, what separates this country from most of the people that woke up this morning on this planet is that knock on the door, right? When you and I hear that, we don't get nervous. But for most of the people who woke up this morning, when they hear this, they hear that knock on the door, it means something different. It means somebody there to take them away because they've worshiped God in a manner they disagree with, or they've spoken out against the government, or they've decided to exercise their God-given right to defend themselves and their family. My mother heard that knock at Bay of Pigs. Castro security forces showed up in the middle of the night looking for her brother, my uncle. And the very first question they asked was, where are your firearms, right? We know that autocratic regimes always try to disarm their population. And we know the Second Amendment is what guarantees the First Amendment. So I'll put up my Second Amendment credentials against anybody. What they're referencing is a piece of legislation that dates back to 2019, in which it actually, the conversation was actually a constituent of mine who made a point that we have in Virginia longstanding, actually this dates back to before I was even born, that if you're adjudicated mentally insane, you can't buy a firearm, you can't purchase a firearm. And this individual, as he noted, was a gun collector, and he said this is a system that drastically needs to be revamped. And so I had legislation that actually did a couple of things. Number one, I said, if anybody lies about your mental health, it's a felony, right? You shouldn't be able to lie about somebody's mental health. Second, when you go to court, you should raise the standard to a clear and convincing evidence standard, which is the highest civil standard you can have in a court of law. Three, if it gets to that point, you shouldn't have to turn your firearm to police. You should be able to turn it over to a family member or a friend, a designated friend of the court. And so my legislation actually expanded protection for law-abiding gun owners. The unfortunate part is we're kind of in the silly season. Unfortunately, when you're the candidate that I think has a lot of momentum, people start taking shots at you. I get that. Mark Twain once said that the truth can get, a lie can get halfway around the world before the truth can put its pants on in the morning. And I think that's where we are. But like I said, I have a lifetime A rating with the NRA. I'm a proud concealed weapons carry holder myself, and proud supporter of the Second Amendment, and always stand up for the Second Amendment as Attorney General as well. I think the second question was dealing with religious liberty. And listen, I mean, if you, like I said, if you know anything about me and my worldview, as I said at the beginning, the dignity of the individual. And what we have right now is we literally have, first of all, we have executive orders that are violating people's religious liberties, governor's executive orders. It is absurd to me that you can go out to the grocery store and get a loaf of bread, but you can't go to your church and get your daily bread of life, right? So I think there's a huge problem when he said specifically towards Christians. I think as Attorney General, you have to challenge that. That is a clear violation of your First Amendment rights and the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, which is one of the single most important documents, not only in Thomas Jefferson's life, but in the life of our country. That's critically important. You should not have a situation where government is coming down and putting the heavy boot of government on the backs of private churches and private religious organizations because they somehow have a worldview different than the mainstream media or the rest of the country. Because ultimately, it's the only way we could survive as a pluralistic society. It's this idea, which is recognize that people are going to have fundamentally a different worldview on a host of different issues. And that's okay. Because the only way we can live in a pluralistic society is to recognize that other people are going to think differently than you. Allow them to live their life and worship their God according to the dictates of their conscience. And you have the freedom to do that in your own sphere of influence. But right now, what we have is this kind of mindset, is kind of Eric Erickson likes to say, you will be made to care, where unfortunately the left doesn't believe in diversity of thought, they believe in conformity. They believe in diversity in everything but thinking. And that's not how a pluralistic society can survive. I don't think that's healthy, and I actually think it creates more division. So I'm a passionate believer in religious liberty. I always defend those that are being persecuted. I don't care if it's by the government or whoever. Freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, and freedom of religion are very core of who I am. As Attorney General, I always defend that.
So, Jason, I think that is the beauty of this kind of chat, right? You have enough time to kind of explain what you actually meant when you passed that legislation versus what actually came out in news, especially when you're a candidate, as you said, you're in the hot seat. So this is, thank you for taking the time to address both of the questions. I do have some more of Facebook chat. Facebook chat has been very engaging with this conversation. All of it is very positive, but I know Vincent has a lot of pressing questions on issues. I'll let him go first.
Okay.
I also would like to ask one question from Facebook. This is from a candidate for 53rd District, our delegate candidate from the Republican side, Sarah White. She's asking, what legislation that you have worked on is what you are most proud of as a delegate?
Most proud of? Well, I had a resolution that recognized the victims of communism. That was both personal for me, but also seeing Lee Carter tried to get up and not vote on the bill because he couldn't even recognize and condemn one of the worst tyrannies in human history that killed and butchered over 20 million people. That was a very vivid moment at that moment. I think, the one that comes to mind just right now, just off the top of my head, because it kind of illustrates how I work, is I like to say I'm not the smartest guy in the room, but I'm smart enough to know when I hear a good idea. And I had a constituent that came to me that said she was a small business owner. And she said, Jason, I have 2 rock star women that work for me that just had children. And I want to provide in-house daycare services for them, but I can't. Because if I want to provide this benefit for them, I literally would have to be treated, I'm regulated, no different than if I open a daycare center for the general public. And I want to provide this benefit for my employees, but government regulations are literally preventing me from doing that. And at first I thought, well, that's absurd. Of course, I did the investigation. I did the deep dive, and I thought, yep, this is exactly right. This is absurdity. So I drafted legislation I thought was pretty darn innovative. It allowed small business owners that wanted to provide in-house childcare services for their children, for their employees' children, that they would not be regulated the same way they'd be regulated if they were just a normal day preschool that took anybody from the public. And that was just a very satisfying bill. We actually had a Democratic governor at the time and actually got out and got signed into law. But it was a great example, I think, how regulations as too can stifle innovation. And I was so glad to do that, because as a delegate, my kind of 3-part test when people come to me with a bill or a piece of legislation is I say, number 1, what's the problem you're trying to solve? Number 2, does your bill actually solve the problem? Because we know a lot of times it doesn't. But 3, what are the unintended consequences? And I don't think enough people in government ask that question. What are the unintended consequences of what you're trying to solve? And that was just off the top of my head, just pops in, because it literally was just a constituent coming to me with a problem and being able to work with them. It was a heavy hand of government regulation that was preventing us from solving the problem. And in this case, we were able to get that problem solved through legislation, and allowed other small businesses to partake and provide that critical benefit to their employees. And so that kind of just off the top of my head. But there's some work I've done on human trafficking that's been really satisfying, that Safe House Project's recognized. I had another situation where a Navy veteran, Navy SEAL veteran's wife came by to see me and said, listen, we have a property tax exemption if you are somebody that has been killed in the front line of duty for law enforcement or firefighters. But the way that it was written, it was so poorly written, that exemption, that it wasn't able to travel with you if you decided to move. And she was suddenly going to get hit with the property tax bill. So I carried legislation to provide that type of property tax relief. So off the top of my head, those are the ones that just come to mind immediately. I carried the first Medicaid work requirement bill, the first welfare work requirement bill, and probably since George Allen was governor, and managed to get that through the House. Didn't get through didn't go through the Senate, but the idea is listen, there's dignity of work. If you're going to receive benefits from the government, you should show that you're trying to be an able body, and you should be able to show that you're working. And listen, I chaired a poverty commission in Virginia, the Opportunity Commission, as we called it. One thing we found is there's a psychological benefit to work. There's dignity in work. And more than that, it gives you a multi-generational impact, because your children see the expectation is when they become older, mom and dad are going to work. And you have a multi-generational impact on things like childhood poverty when you see moms and dads being able to go out and work. So off the top of my head, that's just that comes right kind of at the top.
Well, that's great. That's great to hear that, the list of things you listed, it tells me clearly that you are not really, sleeping like many other delegates do in the House. So that's great to hear.
And also, Jason, I think something that you said, the first favorite bill was what a constituent came up with, right? That tells that you're actually a good listener, because a lot of, not only delegates, I think the minute you become a person, a candidate to politician, it feels like it becomes a pyramid structure. I'm the politician, I'm the delegate, I'm the governor. I get to dictate the policies, but I think it has to be quite the opposite. It's like we as constituents have every right to tell you what is a priority in our lives, not what is a priority for you as a politician. So I appreciate you actually listened to it and you acted upon it, but also if you're remembering it so much, that tells me that you continue to listen to your constituents. Thank you for doing that.
Well, my first race for House of Delegates, when I would go door to door, I would hand people my business card with my cell phone. And I said, listen, that number will not change after the honor of serving as your delegate. And to this day, I still get a lot of constituents that call me on my cell phone. In fact, last year I had an individual that said, hey, is this Delegate Miyares? I said, yeah. He says, is this your cell phone? I said, yeah, I'm in my car. He said, your business card was literally sitting on the magnet on my fridge. And I told my roommate, there's no way that's actually your cell phone. And I said, it is what I just want to invite you over for a barbecue. So I was at pop by and and my cell phone number I give out, it's not going to change if I become Attorney General. And I think it's just important that you are available to people. And I believe in servant leadership. I believe in the idea that, we've gone away from that, quite frankly, with this idea. It used to be you'd have a season of public service. That's what I kind of refer to what I'm doing now. It's a season of public service. And you serve and then you're done and you get done. And the nice thing about the General Assembly is a part-time legislator. So I get to serve for 45 or 60 days and then I come home and I'm a normal human being. I deal with the same traffic. My kids are in the same local schools. I'm dealing with all the same issues. And I think that's what our founders really thought the citizen should be, a citizen legislator.
Yeah,
I have a real problem with the fact that you have a bunch of members in the General Assembly on the other side of the aisle that kept hauling us back into session. And if they had their way, they would turn us into a full-time state legislature, just like you see in California. Well, I don't think anybody looks at what California is doing and thinks we should emulate California. That's for darn sure. I like being a citizen legislator and being a normal human being when I'm not up in Richmond serving.
That's great that you're accessible, and that is the way a true representative should be. So now let's get back into another major issue here, the voter fraud and election integrity. So how will you, as the Attorney General of the Commonwealth, give guidance to protect every citizen's right to vote? What requirements do you believe should apply for lawful voting, and what enforcement mechanisms would you recommend for those requirements?
I think the first thing we have to understand that this is not a Democrat or a Republican issue. This is an American issue. And right before the election, about 2 weeks before the election, there were several surveys that showed that both members of both parties, north of 50% of members of both parties, had real questions about election integrity. Real questions, over 50%. So I know the media likes to try to spin this as somehow this is just somehow a Republican issue. It's not. This is an American issue. This is also personal for me. I have a dear friend who I remember calling me and saying, Jason, I went to go vote and I couldn't vote. And he's a dear friend of mine. Out of respect for his privacy, I won't mention his name, but he's Indian American. And he said, I went to go vote and someone had used my name to vote in my place. And I later had my team look his name up. There was nobody else by that name, a very unique Indian American name. And as he told me, I never forget, he said, Jason, at the end of the day, I cast a provisional ballot, but at most, I had my vote canceled. Now that directly violates your 14th Amendment rights or equal protection rights. If it requires a photo ID for you to get a tattoo,
Exactly.
for you to check out a book at a library or get a library card, for you to get on an airplane, that's just common sense that you should require a voter ID to vote. And I'm tired of the people in the media and so many Democrats treating Americans like somehow we're stupid. All right, we recognize that voter ID is at the heart about voter integrity, protecting voter integrity. So my friend and other Virginians don't go to vote and find out that somebody voted in their place.
Exactly.
Right. And so I think there's a couple of things. One, you have to make sure that our laws are being followed. You need to make sure that you have poll watchers there to make sure that our laws are being followed as well. But I think it's critically important as well to have an attorney general that will protect voter ID laws. And also, as I've said, I want to set up the Office of Election Integrity inside the Attorney General's office. And it's going to be those full-time attorney generals with subpoena power that are simply going to guarantee that our voter laws are followed, that one man, one vote. That should not be controversial. It's unfortunate that it has become controversial, but to Major League Baseball, they require photo ID to pick up your will call tickets, but they're mad they require a photo ID to be able to vote. I think your precious right to vote is a little bit more important than baseball tickets to Major League Baseball, and that I'll always stand up for voter integrity.
Absolutely. This last election proved the gaps in the American election system, and the entire world now knows that it was not the perfect American elections, that they all thought it's happening here. And we really appreciate your commitment to fixing that in Virginia. And I'm seeing that momentum is growing across the country to make sure that one man, one vote with the voter ID and one day elections, instead of the months long elections in America. Thank you.
So, Jason, I'm a healthcare professional by background. I run a mass vaccination, COVID vaccination facility right now. So we verify their driver's ID, photo ID, twice before we vaccinate. We do it at registration. We ask for the date of birth. We ask for their first name, last name, and verify with photo ID. So when I'm vaccinating, because as an operational lead, sometimes you're registering them, sometimes you're vaccinating them, whatever needs to get the work done. So I had a gentleman saying that this is the third time that in the sequence of time, I say, you don't want your vaccine to be given to somebody else, right? So every time, every single time I'm asking for photo ID, just reminds me that, boy,
Right.
We ask for voter ID at every particular incident, and why not when we are giving our vote, when we are doing our own constitutional requirements. So it's kind of very saddening that we are in that position, but I'm glad that you're willing to tackle it. So I'll go ahead and ask about another thing that I am really interested in knowing. I believe the opportunity for transgender biological men to participate in women's sports will destroy women's sport. I hope you agree with me. So if so, what kind of law will you support to protect women's sports from transgender biological men? You have your 3 daughters yourself. I mean, I would love to protect the women's sports integrity. My daughter plays basketball and she's in travel team. She's a real sport girl, but I would love to protect the integrity of women's sports. I'm just very saddened that we are in the place where we are. What's your take on that, Jason?
I like to say sometimes you could be so open-minded, your brain falls out. And I think that's kind of where we've gotten to this discussion. I like the term you use, sports integrity. I'm old enough to remember in the 1990s, the great debate was Title IX sports. There were multiple lawsuits, federal lawsuits about protecting and expanding Title IX sports for women. In fact, there was a lot of the 1990s really revamped college athletics by saying you have to have as many female sports and female athletes on scholarship as you have men athletes on scholarships. I'm old enough to remember that. That was one of the great defining moments. Now we're seeing the wholesale destruction of Title IX sports. That's what we're seeing. I mean, the media could try to ignore that, but that's exactly what we're seeing. I mean, we're seeing we're seeing in high school sports, we're seeing all over the country where you're literally seeing the wholesale destruction of women's sports and in a lot of cases, different women athletic teams. And it gets the absurdity. I think it was in Connecticut where suddenly you had half a dozen state records set by biological men competing with women. So I'll always, the question is, well, as the father of 3 daughters, will always stand up for Title IX sports. Do I think biological men should be competing in Title IX sports? No, absolutely not. It's patently absurd. And sometimes it's just having the strength and not having any type of, listen, I know this is an issue. When you talk to your average Virginian, your average voter, and your average American, do you think biological men should be competing in basketball and track and field and softball and these other women's sports? This is a 70, 80, 90% issue. Sometimes though, you have this loud megaphone of kind of pop culture and the media that kind of is in this circular loop. But I'm always confident common sense is going to prevail. And for me, this is just one of those kind of common sense issue. You either support Title IX sports or you don't. And you can't pretend that you support Title IX sports if you think that biological men should be competing with biological women. That's just end of story.
Yeah. No, thank you for clarifying that. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Jason. And I'm a small business owner, and we heard years ago that Virginia was the most friendly to business environment in the country. Now we have fallen from that grace under Democrat administrations, Democrat governors, and Democrat legislature. Now, Attorney General Mark Herring announced recently the designation of the Virginia Attorney General's first worker protection unit. This is a multidisciplinary team of prosecutors and attorneys within the Office of Attorney General. It will be led by dedicated criminal prosecutor who has the authority to come to the boardrooms of corporates. And that is going to make Virginia a much business unfriendly state. So, and you are aware of this, I'm sure. So as its first area of focus, the team will focus on worker misclassification, wage theft, and payroll fraud, as well as work to coordinate efforts across state government with the goal of bringing cases and enforcement actions to stop worker exploitation. This is what I think. As if business killing unions are not enough, the Commonwealth's Attorney General is planning to walk into the corporate boardrooms to supervise that destruction. What are your thoughts, and how are you going to fix it as the Attorney General?
It shows such a backward mindset. I've talked to so many business owners that have said the Attorney General and the far left control in Richmond, they somehow have this mindset that the business owners, the small business owners, are the bad guy. I've always believed in a bottom-up economy. 2/3 of all new jobs are created by small business owners. One thing that infuriates me is the Republican Party and our policies support the little guy, supports the person who wants to start that business in the room over there, the garage, or take the second mortgage out and open up that restaurant. Because here's a dirty little secret. It is the huge mega corporations that can afford their compliance officers and the accountants and the tax lawyers, that compliance costs are just the cost of doing business. It's the little guys, it's the startup, the ones that create the 2/3 of new jobs, they can't afford it. So the first of all is the mindset's backwards. I was just talking to an individual who owns a towing company. If you know anything about towing companies, it's local government are the ones that actually use them. And suddenly the Attorney General's office is saying not only having to figure out local regulations, the Attorney Generals are now all figuring out how we're gonna regulate them. And if you give me a second, my mother just showed up and I got a letter in the house. And this is Facebook Live, so you never know what's going to happen. So just give me 1 sec, guys.
Sure, absolutely.
Absolutely.
She doesn't want to come on camera, Vincent.
Jason,
She's
thank
too
you for coming
embarrassed.
back.
But I'll finish up.
You can tell her.
I'll finish up. I'm cooking dinner for my family tonight. You'll be proud to know.
But you can tell her these are two fellow immigrants sitting here.
I know. But she's a little embarrassed, but she wasn't expecting me to say, "Come on." So, but listen, the Attorney General's office is right now, they have their priorities misplaced. I'll give you another example. I was meeting with a small business owner in Spotsylvania who just simply wanted to keep his restaurant open during the pandemic, and he was literally being sued out of business by the Attorney General's office. And he said, Jason, I literally had a choice. I could either keep this restaurant open and put food on the plates of my family, or I could close it and lose everything I put in it. He's a small business owner. He's an Afghanistan war veteran. His wife and his mother-in-law are from Chile. I walk in, they're both working. Salt of the earth people. They're like, I just want to keep the doors open to be able to continue to pay my employees and put food on my table. And as he says, I don't feel like anybody has my back. And if there's any reason why I'm running for Attorney General, it's for that small business owner. It's for the person feeling their religious liberties being violated. It's for those cops. They feel like nobody has their back. I want to be there. I want to have their back. I want to be the Attorney General that has their back. And so I always have the mindset that the best thing we could do is keep taxes, litigation, and regulation low. And because you want those small business owners to be able to look in the eye of those people and say three of the most important words a human being can ever hear. You're hired. You are hired. People, that is those words can be transformative for a young person. They can be transformative for somebody who literally is just desperate to be able to make money for their family. We need to be making it easier, not harder. And right now you have an Attorney General's office that is doing the opposite of that. And it's really, listen, Thomas Jefferson called us the laboratories of democracy. We're competing with 49 other states for businesses. They're hearing about our business climate. When Bob McDonnell was governor, Virginia was ranked the #1 state in the country to do business. Now we're not even in the top 10. Heaven forbid if we get rid of right to work. So we are literally having we have misplaced priorities right now in Richmond, both in the governor's mansion, the Attorney General's office, and in the General Assembly.
Thank you so much for that commitment, Jason. Really appreciate that, because as I told you earlier, when I walked away from Democrats, my understanding initially was Republican Party belongs to the big guys, the rich guys, and Democratic Party is the people of the ordinary situations. So after interviewing all these governor candidates, lieutenant governor candidates, and AG candidates, I have been convinced that my switch, in my philosophy and moving to the right side of the spectrum was the right thing to do, because we truly represent the little guy. So that's a great message.
Amen. We really do.
Jason, we don't want to take any more of your time. I know that your mom is here and you need to do family cooking. I can't help but ask this question before we end. What is your view of Governor Northam's recent decision not to endorse Mark Herring for re-election? I know this sounds like a gossipy story, but I'm just really curious to know. It tells a lot about what Mark Herring has done or has not done.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know your perspective.
Well, my joke about the Democratic primary is they're having a woke off. They're trying to show who's more woke and more left wing and more liberal. And I think, I can't describe what Ralph Northam's motive is, other than if he's trying to say that Mark Herring isn't liberal enough. Goodness gracious, he's the single most left wing Attorney General in Virginia history by a wide margin. So I can't speak to that. I just know this. I know that right now we desperately need a check and balance in Richmond. One party rule is really hurting Virginians. It's making us less safe, less secure. And I think we need a check and balance. And so my role in my candidacy for Attorney General, in many ways, it's obviously I'm a former prosecutor. Your safety is my mission. But it's also we need a check and balance in Richmond, because one party rule in Washington and one party rule in Richmond isn't making Virginia better. It's really pulling us down.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Jason. It was a pleasure speaking to you and getting to know more about you and the role of Attorney General. I always want our audience to know that in 2018 and 2019, you were recognized as Legislator of the Year from the College Affordability and Public Trust for your work on transparency and affordability in higher education. I also want the viewers that are watching to know that just a year before in 2018, you were recognized as, again, not only Legislator of the Year from College Affordability, but also from the Hampton Road Military Officers Association of America for your outstanding and dedicated service to Virginia's military veterans. You also received 2019 Action Award by the Safe House Project for your work on legislative initiatives on combating human trafficking and sex slavery. These are all extraordinary accomplishments at such a young age.
Yep.
And I hope you will continue to restore the winning tradition of the Republican Party of Virginia after 10 straight statewide losses that we had.
Well, I'm excited. I'll kind of end with this. One of my, as you could tell with this picture over my shoulder, Ronald Reagan, he said one time, of all the nations in the world, the United States is the only nation in which our national anthem ends with a question mark. Are we still the land of the free and the home of the brave? And I think every generation has to answer that question. But one of my other favorite world leaders, Winston Churchill, once said that Americans always do the right thing after they've exhausted all other options. So I think Virginians will do the right thing this year. I'm ready for the Great Virginia Comeback. Really was great to join you guys. I now have to go start cooking for the family dinner, but so great to join you guys. Hope to see you on the trail ahead. All right.
Have a great night.
Thank you, Jason. And please
Thank you.
feel free to share this video from Fairfax County Facebook page. And I request all the viewers that we have great candidates. So we keep on spreading this message with your family and friends to support our candidates and their values. What that are your values, the small business values, the small men values in this society. Thank you so much.
Yep. And go to jason4ag.com if you want to get involved. Just jason4ag, the number 4ag.com. Thanks, guys. See you on the trail ahead.
Thank you so much, and have a wonderful evening, everyone.